There's been something very interesting happening today in America, which was there was a fairly well-sourced report saying that Donald Trump had been on the phone to Putin
Yes.
and had said to him that he had to remember there were a lot of American troops in Europe and that he didn't want him to escalate the war anymore. That has been denied by the Kremlin.
By the Kremlin.
They say that didn't take place.
I think there are two things going on here, though, at the same time that we need to take into account. The first is actually Biden stepping away from the world stage means there is a bit of a vacuum. Biden has been around for a very long time. He knows a lot of these leaders. You know, he's known President Xi very long time. He's had very set ideas about relationships on the world stage. He's vacated, which means that there are some European leaders who are now vying for that position. Downing Street, by the way, thinks that Starmer's in a really strong position here because they reckon that the UK is going to have the most stable government over the longest period of time. There's lots of turbulence in Europe right now, lots of things not guaranteed. They think that Starmer can play a really decisive role and that that's why he's spending so much time at these global conferences, going to COP, for example, when many others aren't. The second thing here is something that Emily Thornberry said to Adam and me over the weekend on our show. And I think it's worth listening to, whatever you think about Emily Thornberry. She said Donald Trump respects people who have a strong opinion. And, you know, he has respect for people who have a point of view. I think there is an opportunity and a danger here for the UK government, an opportunity to really be clear about what we want. You know, when you ask Downing Street, do we want a trade deal with America? They can't give you a definitive answer. I think we need to be very clear about what we're aiming for here. Which direction are we facing? If it's both, that's fine, but it's a compromise position. Where are we facing and what do we really want? And if we don't do that, are we going to be able to get the respect of Donald Trump? Because a huge amount of this is going to be based on the relationship between Starmer, Lammy and Trump. And, you know, however well that first meeting went when we were in New York and however much they bonded over French fries, the reality is they're very different men. Keir Starmer is a lawyer from North London. He's a very cautious politician. He's not wedded to principles. Trump is a very different kind of guy.
Yeah.
Are they going to get on? I mean, I think that's still a pretty open question.
Well, I want to come on to the question of security in a second. But when it comes to trade, and it's true also of security, there's no such thing as a safe, easy path down the middle. If Britain chooses to say, look, okay, you've got your American tariffs now being slammed on you, we're gonna do business in a way that America does not like. We're going to be running foul of the same tariffs and trade restrictions, and then America is going to turn on Britain because it's happened already in the Trump first term. With important products, there's going to be a point where lots of points actually where Britain has to choose where do we stand.
But we do have to make the point. In a sense, we've already made a choice. I mean, the European Union, membership of the European Union, was a trade deal.
Yes,
and we've rejected that.
Yeah.
Well, it was more than a trade deal for lots of people.
Of course, it was more. But
I think that's the point.
Yeah, but I'm not going to.
Let's not relitigate
not
Brexit.
Yes or no, but I am just making the point that it was a trade deal which we've come out of.
Yes.
So we're now on less advantageous terms with the rest of the European Union.
Yeah.
The European Union basically is saying to us, we'd have to sign up to quite a lot of the things that were rejected in the Brexit if we want a trade deal with them. So that leaves, if a trade deal is very important, that leaves the relationship with America as, you know, the only way to go if you're not going to reopen your relationship with the European Union.
Yeah, well, if it was a binary choice, but it's not. America is our biggest single trade market. The European Union is the biggest market.
But
when you put together 500 million people in the European market.
It's not that it's
altogether.
a binary choice, but if you think about those two priorities, again, go back to growth and immigration, which of those two markets is going to immediately help you on both of those two priorities? And you've got to remember that while we're talking about this in a bit of a vacuum, thinking about world leaders, there is a huge domestic agenda here that the Prime Minister has to keep a focus on. Because, you know, people already are not necessarily feeling much better off. Obviously, they've only been in government for a couple of months. But if that continues and the budget doesn't pay off and growth doesn't come and you start being not able to fund your defence budget because it's coming out of your growth, then that becomes a big domestic problem. And I think, you know, you can't lose sight of that at the same time as all these big global questions.
And a trade war does very little for growth in the meantime. It complicates it. It makes it tougher, quite considerably tougher.
Yeah, one thing you may be able to deliver is stopping the boats. And, you know, if we're thinking about re-election and needing 2 terms, stopping the votes might be very attractive. And relationships with France are going to be very crucial,
Absolutely
essential.
essential, yeah.
Okay, we'll move on in a moment to security. You'll realise we're going through all these headings one by one, coming up with a solution to absolutely none of them.
When do we
But
get
will-
to the? Did you bring us M&Ms back from America?
Forgive me, Kate.
You didn't bring anything
No,
back?
I didn't bring any Hershey bars.
No,
I didn't
no
bring,
Hershey's
No,
peanut butter cups?
I was in a rush going through the airport. That's what I tell my kids.
Goodness
Or at least
me.
when they were young enough to worry about me bringing back chocolate, I didn't. So sorry, Kate. You just got to forgive
I'm
me.
still young enough to worry about bringing back
I know
chocolate.
that is so sweet.
Not from America, that tastes of vomit.
Okay. On that charming thought, this is
Great.
Pinar and Friends. Adam Boulton and Kate Mackay here with me in the studio. You're listening to Pinar and Friends in association with Audi, designed for business. Search Audi, please. I'm John Pinar, and here with me on Pinar and Friends, Adam Boulton and Kate McCann. We're looking at the new world in the second Trump era. Been talking about trade. Now let's talk a bit about security. And one of the issues that we assume was on the table when the Prime Minister Keir Starmer met the French President Emmanuel Macron at the Élysée Palace in Paris a little earlier on, missiles. Kate, we talked about this a bit earlier on, and you told me very, very clearly you don't know the answer to this, so I'll just ask you the question again and see if it's a different answer. I mean, do you imagine that Downing Street is hoping for progress now in this sort of, moving into the period, it's not got an interregnum, but we're waiting for Donald Trump to take over in January, where they can change Joe Biden's mind and say, yes, after all, you can fire those British Storm Shadow missiles deep into Russian territory. He didn't want to go there before. Do you imagine they think they might get a different answer now?
I think they may well be hoping that they could get a different answer. But I think, we were talking, you're right, earlier on about the difficulties with this one, not least the domestic politics in America of President Biden essentially making a pretty huge decision before a new president. The reality is the UK and France both recognise that Ukraine is in a more precarious position than it was. And it's not just because of Trump, it's also because we're approaching winter again. It's a very difficult time in that war. I think it's worth just pointing back to the statement from Starmer and Macron's meeting. It's called a readout. It's what political journalists get to give us an overview of the conversation that was had. And in that, they say the leaders, Macron and Starmer, discussed the situation in Ukraine, including how best to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position going into winter. Now, I take that to mean that this is still a very live discussion. I asked directly Number 10 earlier today. They couldn't give me an answer on whether Storm Shadow was discussed in that meeting specifically. But I think, look, it has to still be on the table. It was being very much pushed by the UK and French side in meetings with Biden just a couple of months ago. Biden said he wanted to see a plan from Ukraine, which he has now seen, and we've heard nothing since then.
Yeah.
And we know that Volodymyr Zelensky is really pushing this idea that, it's a make or break point.
Yes.
And all of this talk about ceding territory in Crimea, handing it over, well, what difference would it really make? I mean, that doesn't help the Ukrainians at all, especially when they're looking at a Donald Trump presidency.
Yes. When you were in the States just about a few weeks ago, okay, this was very much on the table between
Hugely, yeah.
the Prime Minister and the President. Keir Starmer wanted American agreement for Ukraine to fire those British missiles. And they need that agreement because it's a French-British missile project, but it involves US technology, so Biden does have a veto. There was no word from them, but we took that to mean no. And now, of course, we've had an election, and Biden lost, or rather Kamala Harris lost, who took over from Biden. And so the world is going to change again in January when Donald Trump comes in. Does that mean there's more pressure on Biden to do more for Ukraine, Adam? So there's missiles, and of course there's money, because Joe Biden, is it within his power now just to release more money before Donald Trump closes the tap again?
My view is that I don't think France or the UK would go ahead unless they thought it was okay with Trump. I'm not saying that they would necessarily want Trump to publicly approve it, but they wouldn't want him to criticise it. And there's been something very interesting happening today in America, which was there was a fairly well-sourced report saying that Donald Trump had been on the phone to Putin
Yes.
and had said to him that he had to remember there were a lot of American troops in Europe and that he didn't want him to escalate the war anymore. That has been denied by the Kremlin.
By the Kremlin.
They say that didn't take place. So I think we are seeing the transition team and Donald Trump beginning to think which way are they going to go?
Yeah. There was no word from Team Trump about that phone call, was there?
In this conflict. No, there wasn't.
No, but interestingly, John Healey, the UK Defence Secretary, mentioned it in the House of Commons.
As if it had taken place.
So he said,
it was conditional, he said if.
He said something like, I understand that President Trump called and it would be a good early sign and a good indication of support.
Yeah.
And look, I think Adam's right. That's clear. They're clearly, the UK government is using that as an indication of Trump's tacit support for Ukraine. And Zelensky's own statement when Trump won was very much the same. We've had productive discussions. I know that we're on the same side. We need to push forward, etc., etc. I think there's a hope here, but as Adam says, it's a bit of a hope at the moment.
On the other hand, we've also had today a video put up by one of Trump's sons accusing Zelensky of living on an allowance from the United States.
About to be cut off.
Which is quite rich for someone who's lived on an allowance all their adult life. But what I think that shows is that there is very active debate about this, and that even if Trump wants to settle it on day one, he doesn't want Putin to have all the cards, because if Putin had all the cards and effectively there's a sellout, that would be weak. That would show Trump as weak, and it would be the last thing that he would want.